Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor at New Life Presbyterian Church in Yorktown, and welcome back to our series on learning to love Leviticus, where today we are going to enter into a new chapter in the book of Leviticus. We took the last three sessions looking at Leviticus chapter 18, and we're going to move into Leviticus chapter 19, which is part of this section dealing with instructions for holiness, or the holiness code. That begins in chapter 17, runs all the way through chapter 26, which is almost to the end of the book. And so we're going to take up these instructions that we read about in chapter 19 in Leviticus today. Specifically, we're going to look at covenant faithfulness to God's law. That's what I would use to summarize what we find there in Leviticus chapter 19, covenant faithfulness to God's law. And what we are looking at is covenant faithfulness to God's law, because faithfulness to the covenant is at the heart of these instructions that we find in this chapter. The reason I say that is because 16 times we read this phrase, I am the Lord, embedded in these instructions that we read here. And notice that the spelling of Lord there is all caps. The O and the R and the D is slightly smaller in caps. But this is often what you see in English translations as well, when what's being translated is the Hebrew word Yahweh, or the name Yahweh, which is the covenant name for God. There's a number of different words for God in the Old Testament. Elohim are very common. Adonai is another word for Lord. But when you see it spelled this way, with all caps, it's a reference to Yahweh, the covenant name. And that's what we read here so many times in chapter 19. I am the Lord, the covenant God who has bought you and redeemed you. You belong to me, I belong to you. And so our obedience, or the obedience of the people of God, that's being addressed here in the book of Leviticus, their obedience is to be expressed as an expression of covenant faithfulness, loyalty, and love for the Lord, not just bare and dutiful obligation, but a response to the covenant love that God has shown them, bringing them into relationship with Him through His redemptive activity. And so that's important to note. If we break down the chapter, we could break it down like this, that the people were to express that covenant faithfulness by obeying God. And we see that in verses 3 through 10. And of course, all of this is really an expression of obedience to God, but slightly different emphases that we see here. Secondly, in verses 11 through 18, covenant faithfulness by loving neighbors. So showing that faithfulness to the covenant by obeying God, by loving neighbors. Also by separating from the world, which we see in verses 19 through 31 of the chapter. And then finally, showing covenant faithfulness by practicing integrity, which gets us to the end of the chapter. But before we actually go into these verses, and if you haven't had an opportunity to read these verses yet, again, I would encourage you to read the chapter before listening to the lessons. But before we get into the actual content, I just want to provide an overview. I brought it up in chapter 18 and want to deal with it a little bit now. I said we would pick it back up. This idea of how do we know what is binding in the Old Testament in terms of the law? How do we know what's still relevant? Remember, we talked about the abiding relevance of Leviticus chapter 18. But while there doesn't appear to be a strict order here, there is a very clear theme in chapter 19, and that has to do with being holy. That's the overall theme. We'll come back. We'll pick back up to this idea of how do we know it's still binding in just a second. But the theme here is to be holy, which, remember, that is clearly still binding in terms of Christians today who read the scriptures, Old Testament and New Testament, because this command is repeated by Peter in 1 Peter in his letter, and he's quoting Leviticus. And so it's not like this command, this theme to be holy is somehow completely set aside. And we show that holiness by keeping the commandments of God. That's what holiness entails. We're not holy if we're not walking in obedience to God's commandments. And of course, those commandments can be summarized by loving God and loving people. That's what holiness looks like in terms of its I guess, foundational principles. Love for God, love for neighbor. Remember, in the New Testament, Jesus is asked on one occasion, what is the greatest commandment? And he responds by saying, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Remember, that's quite covenantal. This is not just, again, some kind of abstract, dutiful obedience. It feels like a chore. It's about walking in covenant faithfulness and love to the Lord who's redeemed us. And so we are to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. That's the first and greatest commandment. And then Jesus says the second one is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, actually quoting from Leviticus chapter 19, which we're in right here. And so that's the first and the second greatest commandment. Love for God, love for neighbor. That's the principle underlying all of these things. This is what holiness looks like. But in the exact expression of those things, holiness looks different at different stages in redemptive history. Not all of God's commandments here in Leviticus are still binding for Christians today. If you go all the way back to chapter 1 and look at those first 7 chapters dealing with sacrifices, and then the consecration of the priesthood in chapters 8 through 10, the food laws that we looked at in that section dealing with purity laws, those things are not binding upon Christians today in the exact form that we see them in the book of Leviticus. And so in some ways, what holiness looks like today is not exactly the same as it comes to expression as it was in the Old Testament. So we end up with this important question. How do we know which commandments in the Old Testament are still binding? Remember, it came up in an important context in Leviticus chapter 18 with some who question whether the prohibitions against homosexual practice is still in force today for Christians as it was in the Old Testament. And so how do we go about discerning that? Let me just say, first of all, that's a very complex question. There are principles, I think, that we can look at to help us navigate answering those questions when it comes to specific laws throughout the Old Testament. But we're still going to have difficulties with certain laws that are stated in the Old Testament as to how do we do this? How do we know if this is binding? In fact, we have one of them, I think, here in Leviticus chapter 19, which is this restriction about tattooing oneself. What do we do with that? I mean, tons of people have tattoos. Is that breaking God's law? Is that a sin for people to get a tattoo? Well, if we just simply read Leviticus chapter 19, we would have to conclude that yes, it's sinful to get a tattoo. God prohibits that in his law. But is that still a binding principle today as we find it in Leviticus chapter 19? Or is it provisional in Leviticus 19? Is there a principle behind that that's no longer binding? And I know maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, so let's just kind of jump into answer. This will be difficult to do in 20 minutes, but I'll try to keep the video lesson short. Relatively short. How do we know which commandments in the Old Testament are still binding? Well, one of the ways that this has traditionally been done, certainly since the time of the Reformation, but it predates that, I mean, at least recognizing distinctions in God's law in the Old Testament, is looking at ceremonial laws as distinct from civil laws, as distinct from moral laws. So many have seen these 3 categories of different types of law that we find in the Old Testament. They're ceremonial, civil, and moral laws. The ceremonial laws are required rituals that pertain primarily to Israel's worship. And these rituals point forward to and are fulfilled in the person and work of Jesus. Again, we spent a lot of time talking about this when we were looking at the sacrifices in the first 7 chapters of the book of Leviticus, the functions of the priests in chapters 8 through 10. We're going to look at Israel's festivals that were part of the law in Leviticus chapter 23. Those are ceremonial. Food restrictions, ceremonial laws. Circumcision as a sign of the covenant has a ceremonial aspect to it. So these are rituals pertaining to Israel's worship, but because they were pointing forward to and find fulfillment in the person and work of Jesus, we don't observe those laws the way that they were required to be observed in the Old Testament. Now, even here, we talked about how what those laws state actually still are in effect. For example, if you look at the sacrificial system, and we see, remember, we haven't talked about this for a while, but when we began our study of the book of Leviticus, we tried to put it in its redemptive context. And the tabernacle has been constructed because the Lord desires to dwell in the midst of his people, as he did in Eden, to have a people that belong to him. He dwells in their midst, and so he's established this tabernacle. But as he resides in the tabernacle, he resides in his holiness among sinful people. So how are a sinful people able to approach a holy God? Well, they can only do so through the atoning blood of a substitute. the atoning sacrificial blood of a substitute. And that blood has to come from an unblemished substitute. Well, if you just state it that way, is that Old Testament or New Testament truth? That the only way sinners can approach a holy God is through the blood of a sacrificial substitute. It's both. But the form that that takes in the Old Testament is different than the New Testament. We aren't bringing animal sacrifices to our worship every Lord's Day to be accepted by a holy God, but we are by faith claiming the blood of Jesus on our behalf because that principle is still binding. It's just that ceremonial law has been fulfilled. It hasn't been rendered pointless. The principle of the law hasn't been rendered pointless. The rituals have been rendered obsolete because of the fulfillment of those rituals in Jesus. And so that's an important thing to note, that we don't just read the ceremonial laws in the Old Testament. Same thing through the priests, that we need the mediation of a high priest to enter into the presence of God. That was true in the Old Testament as we read through Leviticus. It's also true now that we need a mediator, but the mediator that we have is an eternal mediator. There's not a succession of priests anymore because we have a greater high priest than the one that was afforded under the old covenant through the line of Aaron and the Levites. That's the whole argument of the book of Hebrews, and how we have a superior priest in the person of Jesus who's not from the line of Aaron or a Levite, but he's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And so it's not that all these things just become pointless and irrelevant to us as Christians. That they are relevant, but they are fulfilled. And so the expression isn't the same as it was in the Old Testament. Civil laws are regulations governing the nation of Israel as God's covenant people under the administration of the Old Covenant. And so remember, Israel is a theocratic nation. They are under God's law. And so the law of God pertained to their life as a nation as well, not just as a religious people, a cultic people. And I know that cultic is a word that has negative connotations now because it's associated with cult, but cultic simply means a religious people. But they're not just a cultic religious observing people. They are a nation as well. They're a civil body. They're a state. And so under God as that state, there are laws pertaining to, say, welfare, regulations for the kingship, ownership of land. Remember that the land was allotted to the people. It wasn't to be sold permanently. It had to stay within family lines. Again, the festivals and the food laws come up here again because there's civil aspects to those laws as well. In fact, being a member of the covenant people of Israel and partaking in that nation also involves circumcision. And so is circumcision a ceremonial law? Is it a civil law? Well, that's part of the difficulty of actually recognizing the distinctions in these categories, is that the Old Testament doesn't present them within these categories. It simply presents them as the law. And all of these were actually moral for Old Testament Israel. The ceremonial rituals to be observed, the civil laws, they were all morally binding. But even there's a distinction between ceremonial, civil, which applied to the nation as a theocracy under the Old Covenant, and moral laws. Moral laws are ethical principles based on God's character that inform people in all times and at all places. Again, they're not culturally specific. They're not nationally specific. These are laws that bind all people through all time, in all places, about what is objectively right and wrong. There is objective right and wrong. It's not just all subjective and relative. And the moral laws throughout the scriptures reveal what that moral law is based on God's character, these ethical principles. Now, again, the difficulty in these categories is discerning exactly which of these categories a particular law belongs to as we're reading through it in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament's not going to have lights on that say, hey, this is a ceremonial law, or this is a civil law, or this is a moral law that's perpetually binding. Keep in mind that the ceremonial laws in their exact expression have been set aside or abrogated with the fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Again, principles still there. We learn from those things. We should pay attention to what those laws communicate. But in terms of obeying the laws in the exact ways, that's been set aside. We don't offer animal sacrifices anymore. Same thing with civil laws. We have principles there that we learn from, but the laws pertaining to, say, land ownership are not things that we need to implement today as Christians living in the United States. We're not in a theocratic nation of Israel. But the moral laws are binding. So how do we exactly discern those? Well, that's a task that we have to do under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, prayerfully and discerningly and wisely. And again, some of those questions are very difficult related to specific laws. Some are more obvious. But this at least is a start to help us navigate these kinds of questions. Another approach that we can take has to do with recognizing that sometimes, even in the moral laws in the Old Testament, that they're sometimes stated as plain moral principles themselves. For example, say the Ten Commandments, that the moral principle of the value of life is stated as the principle itself, say in the sixth commandment, you shall not murder. That is the moral principle being stated. And then there'd be all kinds of applications or specific case instances in which that principle would be reflected, that this constitutes murder under these circumstances, in this nation, with these cultural kinds of circumstances surrounding it. But the principle itself is don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness. Those are the principles themselves. We actually have an instance of that in our chapter, Leviticus 19, verses 11 and 12 say, you shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely, you shall not lie to one another, you shall not swear by my name falsely and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. There's that phrase, I am the Lord, right there in verse 12. But what is given to us there are the principles themselves. And actually these reflect the Ten Commandments. You shall not steal, eighth commandment. You shall not deal falsely. Ninth commandment, you shall not lie to one another. Ninth commandment, you shall not swear by my name falsely. Third commandment. And so we have these moral principles stated in verses 11 and 12. But here's the thing. Old Testament laws are often moral principles that are stated and illustrated in culturally embedded cases. And so there's this underlying moral principle that must be discerned and applied to different cultural and redemptive contexts now. The way the law is revealed in the Old Testament is embedded culturally. But we have to discern that principle and then discern how that would apply to us today culturally. Or redemptive. We may be in a different redemptive stage. Remember, that goes back to kind of the sacrifices, right? We're in a different redemptive stage than the people in Leviticus were. They were looking forward to the coming of the Messiah, who would shed his blood definitively and ultimately for the atonement of their sins. But we live on the other side of that. And so we're not offering animal sacrifices. But here's an instance of that, verses 9 and 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest, and you shall not strip your vineyard bare. Neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. So here we have a culturally embedded expression of this underlying principle of how we love our neighbors, particularly how we love the weak and the vulnerable among us. But an exact application of this would be difficult because we don't live in these same cultural contexts, particularly if we're not in an agrarian society, which I'm not. I don't have a field that I sow and that I reap and that I harvest. And so leaving the gleanings on the edge of the field is not something that I can exactly apply in the same form. But there is this underlying principle of compassion and a refraining from accumulation and hoarding to the point where others who are weaker and vulnerable suffer because of my greed and because of my accumulation and because of my consumption. And so there is a moral principle here that ultimately underlying all these moral principles is love for God and love for people. But we have to discern that of what's going on here and how that specifically would apply. How do we care for the poor and the sojourner among us in a non-agrarian context? while we certainly don't exhaust all of these resources, we don't hoard everything. We don't consume everything until it's empty. We leave some for those who are needy and vulnerable among us. And so, we still have a lot of these things today. If you think about cultural expressions or culturally embedded expressions of certain principles, we have old laws on the book that may not make a lot of sense because they are culturally embedded, but there's principles that we can discern. For example, in West Virginia, hats, I believe that all these things are actually still in the law books. Hats are banned in theaters. In North Dakota, you can't shoot fireworks after 11 p.m. In the state of Nevada, you can't sit on sidewalks. In Idaho, you can't sweep debris into the streets. In Alabama, it's an offense to open an umbrella on a public street because it might freak a horse out. And you kind of look at all these and think, yeah, these are pointless laws, but there's principles behind them. Again, times have changed, so we're in a different cultural context. But there have been times where hats were worn pretty high on the head, and if you go into a theater, you obscure the view of those behind you. Yeah, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to go into public places where people have paid money for entertainment and just be completely insensitive and rude when it comes to the experience of other people around you. So you can't block their vision wearing these hats, and so they were outlawed. Now, if hats are smaller and they're on the head, it probably is not that big of an issue. But culturally, at this particular time when this law was probably enacted, hats were taller. Maybe theaters were constructed differently. And so this is actually on the books as an infraction against care for people. Same thing with shooting fireworks after 11. You can't just be noisy. There's ordinances about noise that would keep people up. You can't be a public disturbance because you're part of a society that has to take into consideration the needs of other people, need for sleep. Sitting on sidewalks could endanger public safety. It could be related to firemen, could be related to police officers who need access to sidewalks. With Nevada, it could be an economic issue where you think about a lot of the gambling and tourists walking up and down the streets. One of the things that sitting on sidewalks actually forbids indirectly is homelessness on the sidewalks. If you can't sit on one, you can't live on the sidewalk. And so maybe this is a back doorway of actually keeping the homeless off of their sidewalks, at least in major cities in Nevada, where gambling and entertainment is a driving tourist force. Idaho, you can't sweep debris into the streets, pick it up and throw it away. I mean, you can't just put your trash on public property. The umbrella one, I'm guessing, is related to a time when horses were people's mode of transportation. Which again, it shows the change in cultural context. It's like that would make any sense today because we drive cars. But what about when people's transportation was riding horses? To insensitively open an umbrella, which scare a horse, could actually cause harm and injury to someone. It would be like laws in the book today forbidding certain actions when you're driving, because to do those kinds of things would put other people in danger of injury, an accident, because you're being inconsiderate of others who are being transported or operating a mode of transportation. Maybe we'd say it that way. And so, to think that Leviticus has these laws in the book that we have to kind of navigate, considering cultural and redemptive contexts, is something that seems unnecessarily tedious, is just not really looking at the world sensibly. Because a lot of laws that we have are very culturally embedded, and they make sense in our culture because we live in that culture. But if you go back even 100 or 150 years, there would have been laws there that don't make any sense to us now because we just don't live with those same kinds of technology has advanced, for example, and other kinds of changes have happened culturally. And so, of course, when we read the Old Testament, not just the ceremonial laws and the civil laws are different because of a different redemptive context, but even the moral laws themselves might apply differently because we're in a different cultural context. And so there's an important task to be conducted in discerning, Are the laws ceremonial and fulfilled in Christ Jesus and telling us something about his person and work in accomplishing our redemption? Are they civil laws which communicate to us some principles of justice that might look different today in a non-theocratic nation? Or are they moral laws that are perpetually binding upon all people at all times, but are given to us in culturally embedded principles that have to be discerned? What is that underlying principle behind it in caring for the poor, for instance, or being considerate of another's need for sleep or cleanliness or whatever the case might happen to be. And so this doesn't make the discernment of these kinds of questions easy. Again, the question of what laws remain binding upon Christians today from the Old Testament can be a very complex question. Again, I think a lot of them are easy. I made the argument that Leviticus 18 as a whole continues to be binding. One of the reasons is we see it repeated in the New Testament in different cultural contexts, in a different redemptive context. It's still there. That's not the same as the food laws. The food laws are explicitly repealed in the New Testament. The festivals are explicitly set aside or fulfilled spiritually in the New Testament. Christ is our Passover, so let us keep the feast without leaven by being pure in our lives. But the actual celebration of that festival is replaced by the Lord's Supper. There's a different expression of it in the New Covenant. So some of those can be obvious, but it doesn't make everything obvious. Some of these laws are difficult to discern. And again, the reason I took time to go through this is because the question of homosexuality comes up all the time. It's, well, that's an Old Testament law. Actually, it's not just an Old Testament law. We looked at that last time. There's also patterns in the book of Genesis that are established very early on, which suggests a continuity or something that's perpetual in the practice of that law. But what we're after in the end are these principles underlying all of the laws. And again, what I would argue is what we have in the Ten Commandments, certainly, are the principles themselves. They're not culturally embedded principles where we have to kind of get behind that cultural expression to the actual moral principle. The Ten Commandments are the moral principles themselves. And we have that in other parts of the law as well, in Leviticus, in Deuteronomy, in Exodus. But we have to do more work of prayerful discernment in those areas. So hopefully that's helpful, looking at those different categories and recognizing that when we have law in the Old Testament, sometimes we get moral law that's culturally embedded. Sometimes we get moral law where the principle itself is what's right there, front and center. And so, hopefully that's helpful. But next time we will get into the actual content of the chapter, covenant faithfulness to God's law, Leviticus 19, by breaking it down into these 4 categories, showing covenant faithfulness by obeying God's law, loving neighbors, separating from the world, and practicing integrity. And so we'll pick that up then. Hopefully that's helpful. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Hopefully you'll join us next time.